As opposed to the essentialist and reductive approach Harari took in his book Sapiens, many philosophers in modernity showed that there is no way to know reality as it is outside of human consciousness or without the being of the human. This is why, for the philosopher Hegel, everything is becoming rather than here and now, which is just an abstraction. And for the philosopher Heidegger, any entity we encounter comes into being for us rather than given to us in the present. This means that for Hegel, through universal history, the world around us becomes more coherent, and for Heidegger, through existential time, more profound understandings can be achieved. Human history and existential time are not merely subjective projections, but the ways in which human beings get access to what is real. Hegel asserts that history is moving towards perfection, in which eventually all the individual parts of material reality will come to one whole in consciousness. The Platonic metaphysical picture of reality becomes mind-dependent, but the mind is evolving in Aristotelian fashion. Any individual or plural self-consciousness must accept the self-determined movement of the absolute, spirit, the impersonal subject of thought that constitutes reality, the perfect idea, since subjectivity is subordinated to it. In order to be free, one needs to try to unite with it, integrate oneself into it, through negation. There is one answer for everything at the end of the tunnel, which man does not need to question, but make more coherent by questioning the relationship between all the parts and the whole that contains it. Our thinking about physical reality, reason, and the language that we use in order to communicate it becomes more complete over time. That is, perfect. For Heidegger, on the other hand, reality is not a closed system, and history has no goal, but is motivated and shaped by the question of being. That is, by the question of what it means to be. Humans are historical beings, since their own being has a temporal structure. They are born into a linguistic community they didn't choose, and as such, they are not part of history, but inherit a tradition that they can redirect by facing the nothing and acquire more profound understandings. The physicist Albert Einstein, for example, was able to understand space and time in a different way from Newton, exactly because he didn't rely on a God's absolute space and time, or better yet, that he didn't begin his inquiry by taking God's point of view, but his own. He faced the nothing, the untruth, and began to question the meaning of space and time. Nevertheless, Newton also changed the way people in his time understood physical reality, since he showed that it is not exclusively mechanical. Motion is not caused, but invisible forces change the motion of objects in nature. Both use their imagination in order to discover the truth. The same human imagination Harari discards in his book, since it is a lie. To fictionalize shouldn't be understood only as lying, as relating to something that doesn't exist, as in telling a fiction story, but a capability to see our world and ourselves as unfamiliar in order to understand both differently, without imagining how things that exist could exist otherwise. We won't be able to discover anything new in science and politics. We try to listen and understand the meaning of whatever there is without resorting to metaphysical presuppositions that require men to appeal to a god or ideal language, to something infinite that stays the same and created and formed everything that there is. We cannot go outside our world and see everything from above to see the big picture, because we are finite beings for whom the world is meaningful rather than a container that consists of stuff to be known. This means that we cannot rely on science to analyze reality completely, that is, to explain any phenomenon in more simpler and certain terms. When scientists hit an obstacle or cannot provide a right explanation, they either leave it to the scientists of the future or appeal to a foundation and argue that there are primitive forces in reality that cannot be explained. But this is not very satisfying. Instead, we should let science help us to connect to our world in a more profound way and understand our situation in the universe better. For example, instead of trying to explain gravity, that is, to determine what causes gravity, physicists today are more busy trying to understand the meaning of gravity. They know their point of view is limited, but they also know that their discoveries could be meaningful for the scientists of the future, who will also try to encounter the truth of gravity. But Harari demands more from them. He wants scientists to be his gods and tell him how physical reality really is and who he really is as a physical being. Harari wants scientists to tell him what the laws of physical processes are, since these laws govern his life and history, in order to be able to predict what will happen instead of opening both to change. This is because he doesn't want to be caught in a lie and to take the risk of being disappointed from the outcome of his actions. But as the philosopher David Carr argues in his book, Experience and History, the actions, sufferings, and experiences of other people, human artifacts, and other productions are not only physical, but also institutional, procedural, and developmental. We distinguish between the natural and the social world, but human events occur against the background of the natural world. Nature plays an important role, but a secondary role, as the location and theater of human events. Nature belongs to the human world. But this sense of nature is different than that of directly experienced nature, since it gets its meaning from the actions and experiences of individuals and social groups. A landscape can be directly experienced and explained in terms of the laws of physics, but it can also be understood as a specific environment of some community and the source of its nourishment and building materials. Its geographical features influence the development of settlements and towns. The landscape then is given indirectly to our experience, namely by way of the interest and activities of a particular group. This is as real as it gets. As beings for whom their own being has meaning for them, our actions, values, relationships with others, and intentions are as real as the objective physical world studied by scientists. If Harari would have taken the approach the philosopher Arthur Danto took and tried to understand how we know history by analyzing narrative structure, his work would have been more reasonable. But no, he claims that the stories human beings tell in history and the values that support these stories are just lies. Instead of claiming that they are relative, he asserts, as opposed to Plato, that justice and the good don't really exist in the first place. This makes his line of thought a bit confusing. For Harari, the physical world transcends history and not human agency. But at the same time, he admits that liberal rights and cultural developments, notably the scientific revolution that was supported by capitalism and imperialism, also contribute to the changes that took place in history. On the one hand, he adopts the romantic thesis and claims that the human condition got worse across history since technological improvements alienated human beings from nature and the community. Human beings do not merely use technology, but it has authority over them. It exposes them to physical harm, hardship, diseases, and starvation, and makes them more cruel and violent instead of cooperative and happy. But on the other hand, he asserts that there is no doubt that the lives of human beings got better as a result of their technological advances, scientific discoveries, and their decision to restructure their societies according to the capitalist, individualist ideals. Harari, then, is sometimes a skeptic and a pessimist, and sometimes an optimist and a utilitarian. According to Harari, history is not oriented towards harmony, towards making human life better. If it does, it happens without a warning, as it did during the scientific revolution. It is not clear why Harari believes that the contribution of science to society began in the so-called scientific revolution. Science across history always influenced religion and politics, and the scientific revolution was its pinnacle. When philosophers and scientists across history decided to read Aristotle instead of Plato, they began to observe and understand nature instead of trying to reveal it with the use of mysticism. They claimed that in order to have faith, one first has to understand, rather than the other way around. Harari tells us that according to science, human beings have certain natural traits, but equality, freedom, and other liberal values cannot be taken to be objective, since again, only what is physically measurable is real. For Harari then, the adoption of certain values by human beings is a fiction, but at the same time, he's often puzzled by the fact that human beings across history don't act as they were designed to. He seems to be saying that human beings have a natural purpose they should fulfill, as it is for Aristotle. But in effect, he cannot take this position, since for him, nature is devoid of values. It is what it is, rather than what it ought to be. Later on, he does commit to the utilitarian position and bases his contingent ethical theory on empirical facts, on the desires and feelings of human beings, and understands happiness, like any human activity, as a utility. For Harari, history until the scientific revolution was a fiction, a lie, since it wasn't oriented by the natural sciences, by what is real, that is, by the truth. He claims that he refrains from doing philosophy of history, but in effect, for him, the goal of history from now on is to be controlled by the natural sciences, since historical progress for him is dependent on scientific and technological progress. Harari's thesis is that culture could be a good lie only if human beings act in it as they naturally should, and if it helps to sublimate the irrational, violent, cruel, and intolerant side of human nature. This is also Freud's ethical prescription, which is based on a secular version of the myth of the fall. But history helps us to discover who we could be, rather than reveal to us who we always were and fated to be, but failed to see.